Whilst there are some incredibly obvious mistakes I made in my Spyro tops list, seriously, I deeply apologize and should have revised that script more. One common complaint I got in the comments section of that video absolutely baffled me. The Spyro Trilogy Remaster should be a remaster and not a remake! What confuses me about this complaint so much is that I'm honestly wondering what all of you want out of this product in the first place. Let's really take a second to think about this. Would you really just want the original trilogy of Spyro wrapped up in a new coat of paint with no improvements to the gameplay whatsoever? For starters, I'm honestly unsure whether PS4 graphics alone would even be an improvement to the original trilogy, let alone enhance it. When I first looked at the Crash Bandicoot N. Sane trilogy, for example, I had a reaction that was largely similar to that of the gaming Brits. The game did look updated to fit modern day standards, but I would largely argue that the original Crash trilogy also had its own charm in the form of the low poly art style 3D games had to take back in 1996. It doesn't look necessarily better, it just looks kind of different. Granted, different is cool and interesting to see, but if you're going to go so far as to update the look of the original games, from the ground up mind you, why not also fix some of the gameplay flaws that the originals had? In fact, the assumption that Vicarious Visions, Toys for Bob, or whoever the heck is gonna be developing this remaster won't make any gameplay improvements to the original trilogy is one of a large amount of ignorance. Let's take a look at the granddaddy of these types of remakes, Super Mario All-Stars. Now, I don't even have to say anything. If you go look on the Mario Wikipedia yourself, you'll find a bounty of both small and large gameplay improvements made to the original Mario Tetralogy. Oh, and this is just a small aside, but for those of you who don't think any cut content or beta builds of the original Spyro games will make it into the remastered trilogy, keep in mind that another one of these types of remasters, Mega Man The Wily Wars, had an entire fourth game in it called Wily Tower that is 100% exclusive to the remastered collection. In fact, one of the revisions I would make to my original list would be to have some sort of bonus content similar to this in the remaster, but I digress. It would be absolutely insane not to expect at least something to change about these games moving forward. Let's also talk about introducing multiple playable characters into the original trilogy. Many an individual criticized my inclusion of a playable hunter in the remaster, and I don't think the lot of you really understood where I was coming from. This idea that the levels would have to change drastically instead of the character's moveset utterly confuses me. Believe me, I've played this little game called Mega Man and Bass, where the game's levels were clearly designed for Bass's moveset and not Mega Man's. Vice versa for the bosses, by the way. You know how this game could have solved this dichotomy? Introduce ways to make the movesets of the characters more in line with each other. For instance, instead of having only Bass be able to enhance his vertical movement via the double jump, bring back the Mega Ball from Mega Man 8 to allow Mega Man to perform a similar task. It would require more skill to master Mega Man's double jump, but it is a creative solution. Funnily enough, this also would reduce the amount of character-exclusive secrets that really bog down the pacing of going for 100% in that game. In fact, within my original Spyro video, I explicitly provided an example of how Hunter could play in the regular Spyro levels while retaining their original design. Give him a glider and or give him a high and long jump. Give him arrows in order to do ranged attacks. Give him a ground pound. Give him some sort of special arrow that acts as the head bash replacement. Let him run quickly during sections that involve supercharge. This is basic game design, ladies and gentlemen. Let's also keep in mind that Hunter was not playable and does not have a standardized moveset in the original trilogy. So this isn't redesigning the controls of anything. It's more like giving controls to something that wasn't playable in the first place. You do have an argument though in the case of Spyro 3, as that already has a bunch of alternate characters, and introducing one more would be hell in a handbasket. But you have to keep in mind that those alternate characters are level specific. I am more so talking about creating a moveset for a more universally usable character. Oh, and for the record, there's a huge difference between a separate character and a separate skin for an existing character. What I was referencing by Hunter being the Coco of the Spyro universe was more so the fact of the nebulous idea that Hunter is sort of a sidekick to Spyro. In a playable sense, they are massively different entities. Coco is a Bandicoot-like Crash, so of course the game would allow her to basically be an alternate Crash skin. The way you could implement something like this in the Spyro Remaster is to add in something like a Cinder skin, even though she's from The Legend of Spyro, so it wouldn't make much sense for her to be in the original trilogy. The way you could implement what I'm talking about in the Crash Insane trilogy, for example, would be to make someone like N. Jin playable, which in my opinion they should have done that, as that would have been hilarious, though it wouldn't have made any sense from a story perspective for obvious reasons. Now about that hover and gem finder comment I keep getting, really think about this for a second. Would introducing the hover and gem finder in Spyro 1 actually make the game insanely easier, as many people are insisting that it does? In my opinion at least, it wouldn't really constitute that large of a factor as far as the overall difficulty is concerned. All the hover would do to Spyro 1 is making some of the trickier jumps less of a nuisance to perform. All the gem finder would do is shave off like 20 to 40 minutes of running around an empty stage looking for one gem. In the case of the gem finder, that's not difficulty. That's just walking around in circles for 20 to 40 minutes. In the case of the hover, you have more of an argument. It's true that making the jumps less tedious does affect the difficulty in part, but I have a mind-blowing piece of information for you. Spyro 1 really isn't that difficult of a game. In fact, I would say it's incredibly easy, far easier than something like Crash Bandicoot. If most of the so-called difficulty is just a slight annoyance, which in this case it definitely is, then there you go, it's just a slight annoyance. In fact, another revision I would make to that old list would definitely be adding something of a New Game Plus style difficulty mode to make the original trilogy more difficult. Honestly, this would mostly involve aspects such as enhancing some of the AI of the enemies to more modern standards, making Spyro more vulnerable to attacks, making the enemies more of a threat in general, etc. All of these points I've made are in service of something that we all should realize. If we want the original trilogy in 4K, we can just use an emulator and go to town with it. If you're someone who can't settle for that and want updated models and textures, well, that's a perfectly valid opinion. But just like how you are entitled to yours and convincing me that your side would be what's best for Spyro, I am also entitled to do the same for my argument. Everything I've mentioned in this video is just my personal preference for what I want the remake trilogy to be. Hell, I don't even agree with some of the points I made in that old video. Especially the inclusion of that really terrible parody song. That entire number 1 was just awful. Once again, I sincerely apologize for some of the creative decisions and miscalculations of that old video. Anyways, I hope we've come to an understanding of each other, and if you feel free to subscribe and stick around, I am trying to improve as a YouTuber. Keyword trying.